This is Leon and the Champion Chip, Chapter 22, entitled Furtles. A very quiet hour later, the school bus passed through the wrought iron gates of the Furtles potato chip factory. A watchman emerged from a small wooden gatehouse and flagged down the bus. Mr. Sparks cranked open the door. Good morning. You the group from Classical? The watchman said. We are, said Mr. Sparks. Been a bit of a hiccup in the plans. Mr. Furtles is sick with the influenza, so Mr. Furtles will be showing you around. The statement confused Mr. Sparks, but before he could ask for an explanation, the watchman said, Drive around the back. Mr. Furtles will meet you at the loading dock. Because Mr. Furtles is out sick? Said Mr. Sparks. That's right, the watchman confirmed. The class assembled on the loading dock, underneath a sign that said, Furtles. Fried with pride on the Lower East Side, Leon spotted a short man in a crisp white lab coat approaching. Geez, get a load of that guy. His head's almost as big as Professor Spud's, said P.W. Lily Matisse laughed. All that's missing is the pipe. That's enough out of you three, Miss Hagmeyer warned. The man with the big head approached Mr. Sparks. Idaho Furtles, he said gruffly, Vice President in charge of quality control. He patted the pocket of his lab coat, which had the words Chip Master stitched in yellow thread. Franklin Sparks, science teacher in charge of fifth graders. And these are Miss Hagmeyer, Mr. Groot, and my 18 chip-loving co-researchers. Idaho Furtles scowled. I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not supposed to be showing you around. My brother, Russet, was the one who gave the okay, which, if you ask me, he should never, ever have done. But did Russet ask my opinion? Of course not. Never has, never will. And since Russet is the president of the company and I'm only the vice president, what he says goes. Now follow me. As Idaho Furtles turned toward the entrance, Leon heard Mr. Sparks whisper to Miss Hagmeyer, Seems our Mr. Furtles has a chip on his shoulder. Very amusing, said Miss Hagmeyer, clearly not all that amused. Idaho Furtles moved everyone up a metal staircase and down a long corridor. As the smell of chips grew stronger, so did the group's excitement. Where to first? Mr. Sparks asked. The peelers? The kettles? Maybe the salting station? We will visit the factory floor in due course, said Idaho Furtles. I think it advisable to begin the tour where all the most important work takes place. My testing room. That sounds promising, said Mr. Sparks. I could do with a little snack. Then you would better leave and go to the store, Idaho Furtles said curtly. We haven't stayed in business for over 80 years by giving away free samples. He guided the group to a door that said tasting room. Only someone had crossed out the letter A and replaced it with an E. The testing room was a vast space filled with racks of trays containing thousands of chips. All along the wall, a variety of signs issued exclamatory warnings. All testers must wear hairnets, said one. No unauthorized chip consumption, said another. What a rip, Lumpkin protested. Idaho Furtles ignored the complaint and launched into a brief history of his family-owned business. My grandfather, Flinders Furtles, founded our company in 1921. That was the same year 2 of our Pennsylvania competitors started their operations. But whereas those 2 enterprises grew greedy, sacrificing quality to quantity, we here at Furtles have stuck true to our kettle-cooked roots. We started small, and we've stayed small. Why? Because no bag of Furtles gets sold beyond the city limits. Why? To maintain quality control. How? By making sure every batch of Furtles gets tested and inspected By yours truly. Now come with me and I will show you how that happens. Idaho Furtles took the class to a workbench that ran across one entire wall of the testing room. Man, oh man, look at all this stuff, PW marveled. This stuff, young man, is the finest chip testing equipment available. Much of it I designed or modified myself. So at the risk of stating the obvious, do not touch. Did you hear that, you would-be vandals? Miss Hagmaier said. Tasting chips all day? That's my kind of job, said Lumpkin. I do not taste chips, sneered Idaho Furtles. I test them. What's the big diff? Said Henry Lumpkin. The big diff is this. Tasting is at best a mere hobby, whereas testing is a hard science. Can't be that hard, Mr. Sparks joked. You are mistaken, said Idaho Furtles sourly. Mr. Sparks ignored the tone. That's some microscope, he said. What's the maximum magnification? It can enlarge things 400 times. Impressive, said Mr. Sparks. He leaned toward the microscope. May I? Idaho Furtles gave a reluctant nod. Mr. Sparks peered into the eyepiece. Amazing, he said. What kind of potato chip am I looking at? That's not a chip, said Idaho Furtles. Frying destroys the integrity of the starch granules that infiltrate the tissue. So you're saying it's just raw potato? Not just any raw potato, Mr. Sparks. It's a patented Furtles hybrid, one of the many reasons our chips are as crunchy as they are. Mr. Sparks adjusted the focus. Wow, my students have to see this. Would you mind? Idaho Furtles hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Mr. Sparks looked up. Please, he said. These students will never appreciate the true beauty of the potato chip unless they are given the chance to gaze at starch granules magnified 400 times. I suppose you're right, said Idaho Furtles. Just make sure they don't bump a slide. While the fifth graders stared at potato tissue, Idaho Furtles snapped on a pair of rubber gloves and prepared a few chips for testing. Now pay close attention, he said once and everyone had a turn with the microscope. He lifted a chip from a small paper boat. Why the boat? Asked Thomas Warchowski. For transport and protection, said Idaho Furtles. And the gloves? Said Flossie Parmigiano. To avoid contamination during chipometric analysis. Chipometric analysis, said Mr. Sparks. This was the first question of the day that prompted Idaho Furtles to smile. Came up with the phrase myself, he boasted. Chipometry, the science of potato chip evaluation, is the only way to maintain our standards. Don't you ever eat chips? PW asked. Never, said Idaho Furtles. Now, if I may continue, where was I? Chipometry, said Lily Matisse. Thank you. Chipometry begins with a thorough visual inspection of the chip. That means studying the surface texture, assessing roughness, particulate density, patina, and glow. In my job as chip master, I must make sure our chips are never too oily and never too dry. Idaho Furtles removed a gadget from the wall. This hydrometer is specially designed to register the moisture levels of our chips. He touched the sensor to the surface of his sample. 1.5%, just where it should be, he said approvingly. Next, I evaluate the chip's color. For that, I rely on a digital color wheel. He reached for another gizmo. This unit can match 762 different shades of potato chip, from the lightest yellow to the darkest brown. What about Furtles shamrocks? Said Leon. Idaho Furtles frowned. I see we have an expert in our midst. The boy is correct. We do produce a green chip for St. Patrick's Day. But the shamrock is a dyed seasonal and thus exempt from color analysis. Now, if I might continue uninterrupted. Miss Hagmaier waved her needle at Leon, but Mr. Sparks softened the rebuke with a sly, conspiratorial wink. After I've checked for texture, moisture, and color, said Idaho Furtles, I submit the chip to a smell test. He reached for an aluminum case. What's in there? Said Flossie Parmigiano. This, said Idaho Furtles, opening the case and removing a device that looked like a walkie-talkie, is the Knows It All 3000. Top of the line, state of the art. Furtles is the only family-run chip lab in the country that uses an electronic nose to evaluate potato chips. He touched the snout to the surface of the sample. The sensor helps maintain batch-to-batch consistency. Can't you just smell the chips? Leon asked. Not with the accuracy of the Knows It All 3000, and unlike the human nose, this electronic sniffer never comes down with a cold or sinus infection. After I have evaluated texture, moisture, color, and smell, I must still measure the thickness of the sample. Most brands have an average width of 0.05 inches. That's about the thickness of a dime. But here at Furtles, we batch cook our chips in kettles filled with only the finest premium cold-pressed virgin peanut oil. It is one reason our chips are 20% thicker than the chips sold by our competitors. Idaho Furtles reached into the breast pocket of his lab coat and pulled out yet another gizmo. My Dorenzoff external caliper gauge, he said. I carry it everywhere. Accurate to 0.0004 inches. He pinched the sample chip between the crab-like pinchers of the device. 0.0065 inches. Perfect. Right where it should be. He scribbled the results on a pre-printed form. Mr. Furtles? Said Leon. You again? The chipmaster looked around for Miss Hagmeyer, clearly hoping she would intervene. Unfortunately for Idaho Furtles, Miss Hagmeyer had disappeared. What is it? He said. How about Furtles double crunchers? Aren't they a lot thicker? I see you are acquainted with our complete line, Idaho Furtles sneered. Mister, said P.W., Leon is more than just acquainted. Oh, really, said Idaho Furtles condescendingly. Really, said Lily Matisse. Go ahead, test him. Very well, said the chipmaster. He pulled a chip from a nearby sample tray. Let's see if you can identify this without tasting it. Why would I want to do that? Leon asked. Just as I thought, said Idaho Furtles, returning the chip to the tray. Amateurs, he muttered under his breath. No, hold on, said Leon. I'll give it a shot. He looked the chip over for a few moments. He gave a sniff. Salt and vinegar? Yes, of course it's salt and vinegar, said Idaho Furtles. But what brand of salt and vinegar? Huh? Said Leon. I can't tell you that. It's impossible. Oh, is it? Idaho Furtles said with a self-satisfied smirk. He grabbed 4 paper boats, each containing a chip. To the untrained eye, the 4 chips looked identical. The brand name of each specimen is marked on the bottom of its boat, he said. Shuffle the boats while I turn away. P.W. mixed up the boats. Ready, he announced. All eyes were on Idaho Furtles as he faced the rearranged fleet. Using each tool in turn, he completed his chipometric analysis in under 2 minutes. Starting from right to left, he said confidently, Furtles plain, Cousin Ray's low-fat kosher dill pickle delights, Willy Winkle salt and vinegar, and Okie Dokie plain. Leon capsized the boats. The first one was marked Furtles P. The second one was marked CR LFKDPD. The third was marked WW-SNV. The fourth was marked OD-P. Yow! Leon exclaimed. It was a sentiment shared by the rest of the class. You see, said Idaho Furtles, the proper use of the proper tools allows the true professional to identify a potato chip without ever taking a bite. Taste is highly unscientific, and in the end, drop it! The shrill command so startled Idaho Furtles that he dropped his thickness gauge on the floor. Everyone turned and faced Miss Hagmeyer, who stood before a rack of chips, her needle aimed at Lumpkin. Idaho Furtles scurried over. Caught him helping himself to an unauthorized mid-morning snack, Miss Hagmaier said indignantly. Idaho Furtles inspected the ransacked tray. It's almost empty, he fumed. Don't they teach you to read at your school? He pointed to a sign that said, positively, no sampling. What's the biggie? Said Lumpkin defiantly. I just helped myself to a few rejects. Those were not rejects, Idaho Furtles raged. Lumpkin plucked a chip off the tray, or rather he took 2 chips fused together in the shape of a butterfly. You called this normal? He said. That's exactly the point, Idaho Furtles cried. You've been eating off the specials tray. The what? Said Lumpkin. The tray reserved for candidate chips. Candidates for what? For the Furtles Potato Chip Museum. Oops. In that case, sorry, Lumpkin said unconvincingly. Miss Hagmaier tapped her needle on his shoulder. You are hereby put on notice, Mr. Lumpkin. One more misstep, and you will end up someplace where that army jacket might come in handy. She means military school, P.W. whispered to his friends. That's exactly what I mean, said Miss Hagmaier. Lumpkin answered the threat with an insolent shrug. The unlawful snacking ended the visit to the testing room and made Idaho Furtles extremely grumpy. Without a word, he marched everyone down a long corridor and onto an iron catwalk that overlooked the factory floor. The cavernous space was filled with noisy, creaky machines, most of which were linked together by ancient drive belts and conveyors that whirred and wheezed, sputtered and spat. It's like a giant potato roller coaster, P.W. shouted as a piston valve hissed overhead. Seems like the only microchips in this place are the ones that get salted and bagged, said Mr. Sparks. If you're suggesting we could use new equipment, talk to my pig-headed brother, said Idaho Furtles. I've been pushing to computerize the kettles and switch to a synthetic cooking oil, but he keeps saying no. Mr. Sparks took a keen interest in a thick leather drive belt that looped around the axle of a very powerful motor. The top of the belt ran 10 feet overhead, and the bottom disappeared through 2 wide ovals cut into the floor. He was about to ask about the belt when a worker in overalls pushed his way to the front of the group. Mr. Furtles, the worker said urgently, we got problems. Let me guess, said Idaho Furtles. The salting station? The worker nodded anxiously. The tumbler's going haywire again. Idaho Furtles turned to Mr. Sparks. I'm afraid we'll have to end the tour here. The groans of the students competed with the clatter of the machines. Mr. Furtles, what if I were to guide the class through the rest of the factory? Mr. Sparks proposed. Don't be absurd. But we've traveled all this way. It'd be a shame to come back. That would mean bothering you twice. Idaho Furtles hesitated. The prospect of a makeup tour clearly did not please him. Mr. Furtles, said the man in overalls, the tumbler's already ruined 2 batches of double crunchers. Tend to your tumbler, Mr. Sparks advised. I don't know. Go on, shoo, we'll be fine on our own. Idaho Furtles relented. Oh, very well, he said. Follow the conveyor belts and I will rejoin the group farther down the line. Excellent, said Mr. Sparks. Don't worry about us. I do worry, said Idaho Furtles. But a haywire tumbler is more troublesome than a group of nosy 5th graders. Don't be so sure, Miss Hagmaier muttered as Idaho Furtles and the worker disappeared behind a giant vat of premium, cold-pressed, virgin peanut oil.